G'day, welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to do a video on fixed parallax scopes. Where you should be using them, how to use them, and maybe some suggestions for the industry about parallax on scopes. I've done a video on parallax, adjusting your parallax on a scope and how important it is. One of the almost most important things about inaccuracy is actually not setting up your parallax properly on a scope with parallax on it. And it can actually also be a problem in the way of accuracy, in the way of not using a fixed parallax scope properly. Now, what I mean by that? Basically, your parallax is the thing that you adjust to make sure that when your eye picture moves around behind the scope, if your parallax is correct, then you should see everything move together. The image and the reticle should move together. Normal thing of when you're adjusting parallax, get your eye down behind there, you adjust it to get it right, and when the parallax stops moving around on target, or when the crosshairs stop moving around on target, then you know you've got your parallax correctly set. Focus is a different thing. That's done with diopter, and that's one of the confusions people have, is adjusting your parallax, thinking that it's just focus. You've got to worry about it's actually getting that crosshair to stay still, and if done properly with your diopter, focus properly, then everything should also be in focus as well. So what that means is when you have a fixed parallax scope, and it will be fixed at a set range, what they are, whether it's 25 yards, 50 yards, 100 yards, 125 yards, 250 yards, it'll be fixed at a certain point. And I'll get back to that because that's relevant also. That bit of the conversation is also important. But it'll be fixed at a certain point, and that's the point where you should be able to use it at. So then if the crosshairs are on target, then it's always going to be still at that place. It's going to be doing the job of holding the crosshairs on target regardless of where your exact eye picture is coming from, because it's parallax correct to that spot. If you have a scope that is parallaxed at its set parallax is at, let's say, 125 yards, or 100 meters, that sort of stuff, quite common for the likes of this sort of scope, a 1x1 to 8. It can be common for hunting scopes also, believe it or not, and it'll generally be written on the box. If it's set at 120, or let's say 100 meters, and you're trying to shoot something at 50 meters, you can find you can get a very big group unless you have exactly the same eye position, because every time your eye is in a slightly different position, so every time you face up to the rifle, if it's a tiny bit different position, then that crosshair will be pointing at a tiny different place, and in some cases that can be 6 inches away from where it was aiming at previously, so it'll fire a bigger group. When you get back down to where it's parallax to, then it doesn't matter so much, then it's on. If you go out past that point, you can get the same thing, where you have to have your eye in exactly the same spot. So the first bit of how to use a fixed parallax scope correctly is use it at the range it's designed to be used at. So handgun ones generally be at the 25 or 50 yards, and that's where they should be used at. Using them beyond that point or prior to that point, then you're going to have issues with with how they're actually where they're aiming at, depending on where your eye position is. So that's the first bit, and that means that when you're going to buy a scope, make sure you're getting one that suits what you're actually doing. There's other details involved, and that would get into the fact that because it says it's parallaxed at one place doesn't actually mean it is. It's easy enough to check. You set the scope up, make sure it's still, move around behind it, and find out at what distance that crosshair is no longer moving. Simply, you move your eye around behind there and you'll see the crosshair wander. If the crosshair is wandering and not staying fixed to the image, then that tells you that that isn't the right distance. And you go and find where that distance actually is to know what that scope is actually parallax to. Now, how to use a scope with a fixed parallax at different distances and to actually get around that problem is to use, well, the best way to do it. There's some people which will use a reference. They'll have a forward sight, an iron sight before or after that sort of thing, something to reference. And if you line that up with the scope as well as the crosshair, then that can help. That can sort the problem out. That is less convenient and takes a bit more for the mind to get working and that sort of stuff. But that's one of the ways of doing it. The way I would tend to use what I do with a fixed parallax scope is to use scope shadow. What that simply means is I position the scope out to a place, or get my eye back to where I can start to see that black fuzzy ring on the outside of the image. I shrink that down to where I can actually see that properly and make sure that's centered along with the crosshairs are centered, along with everything centered. That's all centered up. If I always do that, then that's going to largely fix the problem. It might not be as perfect as adjusting the parallax on the scope, but it's a workaround. It will make it work properly if you use scope shadow, and that's how it used to be done for precision shooting when this wasn't a choice. But that's the way to really use it. What I tend to with any precision shooting, I go with a scope which has adjustable parallax. Now that I suppose moves into a little bit why don't all scopes have that adjustment on the side? Well, there's a couple of really obvious reasons. One is it costs more and there's more to build it, there's more to go wrong, that sort of stuff. So one is in a manufacturing side of things, /sales, what you buy, what you pay for, the features you have and that sort of stuff. So one's attached to that side of it. But the other side to it is there's a simplicity of not having to adjust everything. If you work with it, you largely shoot at a set range, that parallax is set up for you, then it's nice and simple. Keep it simple, that works really nicely. The other feature is with adjustable parallax, when you have that on a scope, that can cause as many problems as having no adjustment. That is, if you don't set it up properly. So understanding how to adjust your parallax properly. We have a video on there, on the channel, which will go through and explain that. But adjusting it properly, that side thing is not a focus ring. As much as you do focus it to the distance, it's actually doing two things. It's doing the focus, but mainly it's called a parallax knob because that's its main job. Its main job is to make sure the crosshairs are straight. If you set up your diopter correctly, on 95% of scopes, the two will work properly together. But crosshairs, move your eye around and make sure they're on, and that is where you'll find your precision from. And it's certainly how I like scopes to be and what I'd largely use. But as said, there is places where I use a fixed parallax and it works well, but it's in the understanding of where it's used. In mine on a rifle, it's parallaxed at 100 yards. It's largely where I shoot it to, and I make sure of the compromises either side of that. And you'll also find that the way some scopes are set up with their lenses and bits and pieces, even though they're not perfectly parallaxed they're set up for 100 yards, you're trying to shoot at 50 yards, they're not too far away. It's not as bad. And like I said, it depends on the scope and you've got to check it. The last thing I would say, and the reason I've got these scopes in front of us, this is another one of those little 3x9s. I have a couple of cheap, they're just cheap ones, of the 1x8 scopes. So tactical sort of scope, and you can get you can spend a lot of money on this sort of scope. And I haven't got myself to go to that place because they are, no doubt there's some, I think I found some when I scratched around enough, but even in the top end of town, when you go to a 1x8 scope, it is kept keeping it simple, I presume. Tactical side of things, they're largely made just for close quarters or whatever the reason is, but they don't have adjustable parallax. And to me, some of this, just a little cheap Vision King, you go to something won't mention any brands, well, all of the brands, a $3,000 or a $4,000 or a $5,000 1x8 scope, and it still has a fixed parallax, largely the 100 meters, the 125 yards, 110 meters, that sort of stuff. That's largely what their fixed parallax is at. And in actual fact, in all other sensors, even though they have a very small objective lens, they're still quite capable, and I have certainly used them out to 1,000 meters without any problems. They have very good glass. Everything else is really top-notch in them. The bit they're missing is that you have to come back to using scope shadow to use them accurately out at long range. And that's something that I think if we're spending all that money on a scope, boys, industry, all you guys out there, step up. At least give the choice of an adjustable parallax on that sort of scope, and then take something that then turns into a good weight for hunting, good weight for tactical, good size, all the features they have, but give us that adjustable parallax so that we also have the ability to be able to use them in the longer range on a true rifle that's trying to do everything in that sort of job. I think that would be a very good feature. Might be some other details, I don't know. I haven't had the conversations with industry about that sort of stuff. I'm doing it right here and now. It just came into the fact I had questions about a fixed parallax scope. How do you use a fixed parallax scope? That's it. Largely scope shadow is the way to do it. But the big key really is do your research. Don't go and buy one because it says a rimfire and think it's going to work. There are rimfire scopes that are great scopes that are parallaxed at 100 meters. So that's not going to work really well for where most of your 22, let's say we're talking about in a rimfire, your 22 long rifle, you're largely shooting 25 to 50 yards with that 100 meter parallax. That doesn't suit you. And I've seen the opposite. I've also seen some very good high-end European scopes that are supposedly fixed parallax at 120 or 100, I think it was 150 yards. When they actually the guy checked it out, worked it out properly, it was just under 250 yards is what that scope was actually parallaxed at. So it's a grey area. Parallax is a super, super important thing. Good parallax, good control of it, making sure you understand it. It's more important than your glass quality to some degree. It is what points your crosshairs on target, and that's ultimately what we're using to get accurate shooting. And if it's moving around with different eye positions, one thing I would come to, there is another thing that can sort of fix this, and that is if you have really good cheek weld, really good consistent eye position, where it is always exactly the same, and I mean millimeter perfect, that can also answer this. I didn't mention it, I don't tend to trust it because millimeter perfect eye position because of your cheek weld and things is something that is very rarely actually happening, and people who think they have it still have accuracy issues, and it's still been fixed with sorting out the parallax, so it's not something I would tend to use or trust. Scope shadow you can, but like I said, that's the bits and pieces. Get the right thing for the job, use what you have as well as you can, and it should work for you. Anyway, that's my little video on that one there. Fixed parallax, how to use it, where to use it, and maybe we could have a little bit of change in the industry and get it removed from some places too. Anyway guys, I hope that makes some sense. Thanks for checking in, and we'll catch you next time.